Now, South Africa needs 1.7 trillion for the just energy transition. Speaking at the Climate Resilience Symposium, President Cyril Ramaphosa said that South Africa requires a $98 billion, that is, of course, 1.7 trillion investment from 2023 to 2027 to meet its 2050 decarbonization targets, according to the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan. Joining us to discuss this further is Ruse Moleshe, RUBK Managing Director. Good afternoon, Ruse. Thank you very much for your time this evening. So we need 1.7 trillion in 5 years. That's an awful lot of money. The president announced, of course, that the Just Energy Transition funding platform will be launched in the next few months. Your views on this particular platform, firstly, and its viability?
Good evening to you and to the listeners. In terms of viability, I mean, we had the climate. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ruse. You can go ahead.
Okay, all right. So we've had the Just Energy Transition Plan, which is looking at areas where we would mitigate climate change. And part of that was the decommissioning, a big part of it, decommissioning of the coal-fired power fleet, as well as looking at things like electric vehicles and different projects. And that money has not really materialized. So there needs to be different ways of finding out how that will happen. There is no real concrete plan on the table, except you are mentioning the platform. From my perspective, the platform is still something that's in the planning stages, that one cannot evaluate thoroughly, because the projects will be done on a project-by-project basis. So when you are funding a project, you don't fund a program. You fund specific projects that are prepared, and they have to have specific variables that you evaluate. So I'm not even sure how to assess it, to be honest.
Now, it's said that the funding platform is, of course, some sort of a precursor to a broader just transition financing mechanism. Do you see those South African businesses heeding the president's call to invest in the projects needed for this successful just transition in this country?
The way I understand, when you are looking at funding, yes, there may be commitments, but commitments tend to be generic. When you are looking at funding, you need to be evaluating the risk of the project materializing or not. And when you are doing that, you have very specific things that you look at. For instance, you want to know if it's located somewhere, let's say a renewable energy project located in the Northern Cape. You want to know if the environmental impact assessment will make sense. You want to know whether it's close to the grid or the infrastructure for connection. You want to know a whole lot of different things that are related to the specific project, not a program. So there may be, however, pools of money that are available, but they will be, the determining factor will be the projects themselves.
So where do we find 1.7 trillion?
South Africa has a tendency of drawing up plans and coming up with numbers and not assessing the doability or the implementability of those plans. In my view, whether it's however many trillions it is, at the end of the day, do we have a concrete plan? Do we have a pipeline of projects that can be bankable, that can be put in front of financiers to finance them? I think that we are prematurely at that stage, and therefore it will depend on what projects come up in the near future. So to look for the funding when you don't have the actual pipeline, for me, it's also sort of a pragmatic way of looking at it.
But many are, of course, talking about the grants, that perhaps consensual grants are ones that we should be pushing for more, as opposed to any kind of funding. Where do you stand on just that conversation?
Grants are obviously always better, because then they reduce the cost of funding and they make the projects viable. So it would be obviously better to get grants than to get loans, because loans then will be heavy on National Treasury in terms of having to pay back and South Africa indebtedness. So it would be better if you can get more grants than loans. But so far, the funding that had been pledged previously was linked to more debt funding than it was to grants. Yeah.
Now, help us make the distinction between just transition financing versus climate financing, because some tend to, at times, confuse the two.
So the just energy transition is supposed to be just in terms of being sensitive to the fact that if, say, for instance, you were transitioning from coal-fired power plants to lower carbon technologies, and that there would be impact on communities, on the economy in general, on employees, that transition should be taking account the financing of the mitigating factors with respect to that loss of income, loss of opportunity, So that's what it's about. Climate financing could be just looking at a particular project that has a mitigating impact on financing, and therefore you just finance it on the normal basis, but the finance is targeted towards greener projects. So the difference is the just element of it. That means you need to consider the impact of changing or transitioning from one system, which is high carbon system, to a lower carbon system.
And I want us to turn our focus a bit on the politics of just transition, that in as much as there are economic considerations, there are social considerations, there's also climate considerations, but there's politics as well. Some have said the country is extremely slow in transitioning to cleaner energy and conveniently hides behind the term just transition. It's almost that proverbial fig leaf to hide behind. Do you share this view, or the pace is good enough given the economic implications of abruptly ending reliance on coal?
The pace should consider a security of supply for the country, because again, it would not be just to not have access to electricity, which is a key input to all sectors of the economy. So in the absence of a credible plan that helps us to transition right now, we can't just switch off the coal-fired power plants that we have without a credible plan. So the pace of it is dictated by the fact that we don't have those resources. And also, if you look at European countries that have been transitioning, they have access to an integrated system where all of the countries are integrated with each other and can help each other in terms of connection of electricity, whereas we in South Africa have got smaller regional partners with relatively little electricity that we can share from an integrated point of view. So it's I think that each country needs to look at its priorities, look at what's reasonable and what's doable, to be able to then say how quickly do they transition. For instance, Kenya has got access to a lot of geothermal, which is renewable energy sources, and that's a significant resource that they can use. So they can quickly transition. They actually have transitioned.
All right. Ruse, thank you very much for your insights this evening. That's Ruse Moleshe, RUBK Managing Director.